Thank you and welcome everybody. Thank you for attending. This is the last in our series of the Northridge Earthquake 30 Years webinar series. We've tried to focus on it being a catalyst for engineering resilient communities. Next slide. This series has been organized by a series of partners, the American Society of Civil Engineers Infrastructure Resilience Division, the American Society of Civil Engineers Los Angeles section, the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute Southern California chapter, the Structural Engineers Association of Southern California, and the Earthquake Country Alliance led by the Statewide California Earthquake Center. This being our last, and for sake of time, I'm going to thank all of those organizations. I will not be able to identify all of the people, but I want to thank them for all of their contributions throughout the year. It's been terrific. This is the 8th episode. We have, Mark is showing you here the first 7 episodes by title, presenters, and you can find them on Earthquake Country Alliance, earthquakecountry.org. All of them are recorded, and I welcome you to go look at all of those at your leisure, and please share that information around for others. I want to thank all of the speakers for all of them. I'll speak to current webinar speakers at the end, but all of the past speakers, it was a tremendous job, and we thank them for all of their efforts in putting these forward. Next slide. So, like I said, this is episode 8. This episode will be moderated by Louise Comfort. And so at this point, I want to welcome Louise to the platform, and I'm going to mute myself, and she will take it from here with the speakers.
Thank you, Craig. It's a pleasure for me and an honor, actually, to be moderating this last episode in a very distinguished series. And this episode is really focusing on rethinking communication about seismic risk and linking knowledge to action in innovative ways since the 1994 earthquake. The 1994 earthquake 30 years ago was really at the cusp of the transition to widely available communication technologies. Everyone did not have cell phones at that time, a fact that was emphasized by FEMA's distribution of 3,800 web phones to, or excuse me, cell phones to its staff at the time. But it was a different communications environment. First of all, Los Angeles, very sophisticated communications environment, media, multiple television, radio channels, etc., was very effective. But what was interesting was the rapid response among the response agencies, and that came through preparedness, investment in communication technologies, a situation where there were disaster declarations declared literally within 8 hours from the city of Los Angeles, the county of Los Angeles, the state of California, and FEMA at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. But what we learned is that communicating about risk is a different matter. Response is something very obvious. People have heard it, they've seen it, they know the danger, but risk hasn't happened yet. So getting people's attention, mobilizing them to act is a really different challenge. And we see the value of preparedness because we saw it in the response episode, but thinking about innovative ways in which we can engage people in the communities in preparing for their own safety and their own communications in an area that is subject to risk, as Los Angeles is again. And at this seminar, I want to introduce the 2 speakers, 2 excellent speakers, very well known in earthquake country, Dr. Ron Iguchi, who is the founding CEO and president of ImageCat. And a quick anecdote, Ron brought his computer and was sitting in the Emergency Preparedness Center or a response center in Pasadena, turning out maps for earthquakes. Our second speaker will be Lucy Jones, again, very well known, worked for USGS for years, and now is focused on her own research center, looking at different ways of engaging people in active preparedness and response for earthquakes. Lucy and Ron, I will let you add to that introduction as you begin your statements, and I'll turn it over to Ron as the first speaker. Ron?
All righty. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, let me start by sharing my screen. Okay, Luis, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, I am. You're fine.
Okay. All right, let me do one thing. Move you guys out of there. All right, well, I've known Louise for a very long time, and she knows how passionate I am about defining and quantifying risk, and I've done that, or I've had that interest ever since being a grad student at UCLA many decades ago. And so when Louise invited me to participate in this webinar, I was very happy to participate. Anyways, what I'm going to talk about is how technology has been very effective at improving our ability to communicate, risk to a broader set of stakeholders. Excuse me. And I want to do this by separating my presentation into three different parts. I think in order to give, the proper perspective on kind of where we were, what Northridge did in terms of, helping us to move things along in the area of risk communication and where we're going. I think it would be good to be able to see over the past maybe 30, 40 years how risk communication has evolved, largely because of technology. Let's see, I'm not sure why this is not moving. Okay, so I'm going to start with a quote. And I think this quote is very appropriate. You don't know how far you've come until you've been able to look back. And there have been a lot of things, that we've been able to look back on that have really formed, I think, the foundation for how we quantify risk and how we communicate risk. And one of the areas, or one of the products that I think has been very, very valuable has been the series of reports that were produced by the California Division of Mines and Geology, CDMG, which is the predecessor to the CGS. And in the 1990s, what they did was they produced a series of scenarios that helped communities begin to see and plan for large earthquake events. There were event scenarios for Northern California, Southern California, and I think they were extremely valuable in bringing the community together, as well as stakeholders that would be involved in some sort of response to a large earthquake. So you see here some of the maps that were produced by this series of studies. In this case here, this is a map. You can't read it here, but it's essentially a ground motion or intensity map for a scenario that would be on the Silver Strand Fault in San Diego. And these things are very, very important because they give you a good idea of, where the high ground shaking intensities would be, and also areas of potential liquefaction in this particular case here. And this is very important for trying to look at how various critical facilities, for example, here you see one for hospitals, what sort of intensities might be expected, so that they would be able to incorporate that into their planning. Utilities were also included as well. And this is very important also from the standpoint of look at trying to quantify ground failure hazards such as liquefaction, because lifelines and particularly underground lifelines are going to be very well affected by, by those kinds of effects. So even though these things were there for the time, I think they were very, very effective, very important, and really served as a great foundation for things that we're doing now. I think there are some drawbacks that made them maybe a little less useful, particularly if you're looking at things now. For example, it took a very long time to do the analysis and to write the reports. The results were static. That is, for example, if you wanted to investigate various, say, different assumptions and maybe different parameters, it was not very easy to do that. And also, if you want to kind of drill down to, what the effects might be at selected sites, is very difficult to scale using maps. And then the format, hard copies, the distribution of this couldn't be done very easily. And so I think that, from the standpoint, also from decision making, it was a lot harder to be able to incorporate, broader stakeholder involvement in these sorts of studies. Anyway, I'm going to move into the second part or phase of the presentation, and that is this is focused on the importance of the Northridge earthquake and how it changed, what we currently do, in trying to characterize risk. And I start with this quote here: "A picture is worth 1,000 words." I think this is something that, we all perhaps have used. And I'm going to put a little twist on this. I'm going to say an image is worth 1,000 actions. And what I want to focus on, in a number of months ago, I participated in another webinar series with Dave Wall, where the Northridge earthquake, I think, was a very important but unexpected milestone in earthquake loss estimation. And one of the points I made in that prior webinar was that GIS maps and the things that OES did along with FEMA in trying to portray and then also provide information for monitoring, that event, I think were really very pivotal in terms of, how we do things now. So when I showed the maps in the prior webinar, they included a lot of important information for things like, for example, how individual assistance was distributed to the different communities, how the challenges of language, for example, were addressed in terms of trying to reach out and share information on the earthquake. And then also things like, for example, trying to manage and monitor shelter needs. These are all very important things. But one of the things that I mentioned in the earlier webinar was that loss estimation was something that I think was really triggered by the Northridge earthquake. And I talked about EPIDAT, which was the early post-earthquake damage assessment tool that was developed by EQE for OES, and HASIS by FEMA. And all of these, tools, I think, became very important in trying to characterize, what sort of effects might occur in future events. One of the things that we did for OES a number of years after the Northridge earthquake was to create this tool INLET. And INLET stands for Internet-Based Loss Estimation Tool. And the important development here is that we wanted to begin to take the sort of digital files, the data that, that were used for these types of studies earlier, and incorporate them in an online environment. And so you can see here the faults affecting Southern California. some of the critical facilities that could be mapped, for example, here in the case of hospitals. But I think the more important thing is that the ability to choose earthquakes, for example, an epicenter and how it might be distributed to a fault, or to select a fault and then select the magnitude and then calculate the ground motion intensities that might occur from that earthquake and what the effects that would be in terms of building damage and also casualties. This is something that I think is a very, very important development and should be a standard, I think, as we move forward. Okay, I'm going to proceed into the last part, and then may the force be with you. You're wondering, well, what is this? Well, one of the things that I want to talk about here is some work that ImageCat Charlie Hike in particular has been doing, which focuses on trying to develop a global economic disruption index that projects what the long-term effects would be from very large disasters, including earthquakes. And this is work that's been sponsored by NASA, and we want to certainly thank Shana McLean, the project officer for that program. So Charlie and his team have been very passionate about trying to find new ways of not only understanding but quantifying the full effects of natural disasters such as earthquakes. And this would be done not only temporally, but also spatially. And Charlie has produced a paper that will be published very soon that begins to look into the broader effects in terms of economic losses and how that might affect, for example, a more global community. So what was the genesis of all this? So in 2011, there was a very serious flood in Thailand, which affected some very critical facilities. For example, there were hard drive and automobile parts manufacturers. And it turns out that these facilities were all located in a few hundred buildings that were all flooded in this event. And so, this affected not only the economies in, say, Thailand, but there were a lot of businesses and things that were being done outside of the country. For example, in Japan, Toyota had some production facilities that were basically disrupted because manufacturing parts, were not able to be delivered to their factories because of damage in Thailand. And so this emphasizes, I think, the importance of the supply chain problem. So what Charlie did was he designed a framework, and he called it JEDI, which stands for Global Economic Disruption Index. And it was included basically 4 components: hazard intensity, exposure, here is expressed as, say, production capacity by sector, vulnerability, and institutional and political resilience factors. So this looks like, sort of the loss estimation, model that we're familiar with, where we're computing damage to facilities and losses. But it goes much further here in the sense that, we're looking at now what the broader economic impacts are. So this notion of a tipping point, what is a tipping point? So we're familiar with, the notion of resilience, how resilience is very important in the recovery of different communities. And of course, as the magnitude of the event occurs, more resilience is required in order to restore or at least bring back the community to where it was before. But there is a tipping point, where maybe the magnitude or the impact of the event is much larger than the resources that are available. And so what you get are these cascading failures. In other words, damage to one facility may actually impact the ability for other facilities to operate, even though they haven't been damaged because the supplies from, say, company A can't get to company B. So the idea of trying to measure these impacts, I think, is very key. So one of the things that Charlie's done is to define an index, much like, the modified Mercalli index, the MMI index. But this one here focuses on economics, and it focuses on long-term disruption. And so how do we begin to measure something that might be indicated by this index here? And what impact does Earth observation data play into this? So here you see a map of Bangkok, and you can obviously see the urban areas. So most of these are visible using satellite imagery. This can be translated into sort of intensity of activities. So using image processing techniques, such as, for example, night light data, you can see what areas are using a lot of power, and the brighter areas indicate higher, I think, usage of electricity, for example. And so this begins to give you a good idea of where all the operations and things are occurring. Now, if you overlay onto this things like, for example, maybe hazard data sets and so forth, you begin to sort of put together the loss methodology that I described earlier, where you can begin to quantify what the impacts might be during that event and maybe longer term. And to begin to look at the economic impacts, you want to try and tie it to things like, for example, economic models. And one of the things that Charlie has incorporated is the OECD intercountry input-output tables. So this gives you an idea of how the various, economies are tied together. And this particular database covers 64 countries and 36 different economic sectors. So this gives you an idea of how the different countries depended on different economic sectors that were in Thailand during the floods in 2011. So the dark areas, the red areas, indicate areas where there was much more usage and where there was bigger impact. And if you begin to think about this as a starting point, for example, computers were a very big part of production in China. There's another matrix where China, with the same economic sectors, would impact other countries. And so you can see this sort of interdependency sort of filtering through various countries and for the globe in general. So what sort of applications, would this sort of index and the ability to measure this, what sort of applications are there? So, for example, people are aware of the, SEOASC and real-time advisories, trying to incorporate this sort of measure into that, I think would be very useful in terms of looking at investment portfolios. There is application there for CAT models, and also for looking at opportunities to be able to better harden and protect infrastructure. So at this point, I'm going to stop. My wife always says I talk too long anyway, so I'm going to stop here and then wish everybody a happy holiday.
And now I'm going to, you can hear me but can't see me because apparently I can't start my video. But I will introduce Lucy Jones as our next speaker. Lucy, very well known in Southern California, really the originator of earthquake country and the Great Shakeout, and now is onto new ideas and new things about communicating risk. So, Lucy?
Hi, thanks. I am going to be talking today about some pretty different directions I've taken since the time I was working on Northridge. I will, and in the process, I think I've learned the limitations of what the direct science can do. I was thinking Northridge is sort of a turning point for me where I'd been completely working in earthquake statistics, trying to get probabilities to communicate risk. And after Northridge, ended up putting down roots in earthquake country, working with designers instead of trying to do the probabilities. But I think rather than follow the pathway, I'm just going to jump ahead and talk about some of what I've learned along the way. As Louise said, I left the U.S. Geological Survey 8 years ago now, and have started a nonprofit center to give me somewhat more freedom to look at different areas of risk. In particular, I've ended up doing quite a bit of work in climate change because, let's be honest, guys, what's coming from climate change is going to be worse than what any one earthquake can do to us. But of course, risk is risk, and our psychological approaches to doing this transfer across all of these different disciplines. What I'm going to show a bit here is a lot based on the work I've been doing the last couple of years in something we call Tempo, Music for Climate Action, where we are bringing together the climate scientists who know what we need to do, much like our earthquake scientists here, the social scientists who study the emotional barriers that are keeping us from acting, with musicians who know how to evoke emotion, to learn how to put the power of music to changing the emotional climate about climate change. But when I presented about this, Louise definitely saw how the application of this comes back to the earthquake side in many ways, and that there's principles that we should be doing here. I'm doing this based on a lot of work, especially by Daniel Kahneman and Paul Slovic. I think many of you know this work that he's done with the fast and slow thinking, the idea that we have parallel processing systems within our brain, both of which are functioning, overlapping, but affecting how we look at questions, basically all decision making. Paul Slovic particularly brought it together to look at how we feel about various types of risk. And I'm going to use his description of the two parallel processing systems because it's the most applicable to what we're doing in risk communication. And he made a point that you've got this analytical system. This is what we do as our scientists, right? It's logical. We get out facts. We do models. We take time to do the testing of it. All of this tends to make for more accurate information, but it takes time and work and is not what we use for immediate decision making. Our affective system, affect being a psychologist's word for something close to emotions, but just the general feelings that you have. That you have an affect of what feels good or bad. And we do it very rapidly. It gets us to be able to, quickly run away from a predator. We do it based on experience. We don't take the time to do the slower processing. So you get the more accurate result from the analytical system, but it's the affective system that controls the decision to act. They've done studies on people who, for brain damage, no longer can access emotions, and those people are literally incapable of making decisions. We always have an emotional component to a decision that makes us feel that it's the right thing to do. So if we want to actually do more than just communicate, but we're trying to get people to do something with the information, that affective system, the emotional engagement, has to be there for the decision to act. and what does it mean to engage the affective system? I mean, we're evolved creatures. There was a time when we needed to be able to respond to the predator coming very quickly, and we have a direct emotional response and a direct reaction to it. Earthquake information is presented in very different ways. We have graphs like this, right? This is from the Turkish earthquake that was in 2023. And here we see that what the building code was showing, asking for in black dotted lines, and then the actual recorded data. And those of us who are used to looking at this can get really scared from looking at this data, because I know we use the same building code that Turkey does, right? So, but most people don't respond to data by developing an emotional reaction. Most people need stories to get their emotional response engaged. A second point to think about with this: when you decide to act, you are collapsing your probabilities to either 0 or 1. You've decided it's worth acting or it's not. And for some people, those probabilities can make an impact in how you get to that decision. But once the decision's made, probabilities are no longer really relevant in whether you're making the decision to act. So how do you, as I said, we need stories often to be able to get the emotional engagement. I think that's what we did when we did the shakeout. We even, the public version of it, we said, was a story that Southern Californians are writing. And that allowed people to make more of an emotional engagement to the results that we gave. And I think that was one of the reasons that shakeout turned out to be effective in getting policy changes. I mean, because of shakeout and the work then being done with Mayor Garcetti, spreading on to other cities, we now have 7 different cities in Southern California that have passed mandatory retrofit of software story. More of them are still working on it. We've had a lot of work that's come in on the water system. And I do think that the story of shakeout helped get us that engagement. Another thing that was pretty important when you want people to think about it is you can't make it too awful, right? If you feel really afraid of something, you're going to do a lot to not be afraid. That's a very fundamental, evolved response of the human person to facing risk. We will try to get away from fear, right? But if you feel that your actions don't make a difference, the only way to not be afraid is to not think about it. And with a long-term risk like earthquakes or climate change, that is a really valid psychological approach to dealing with the fear. And so I think one of the other things that happened with the scenario and the way which we used it, we emphasized financial outcomes, not how many people were dying. Of course, mostly we aren't killing a lot of people with earthquakes at this point. The big issues really are financial. But people need help remembering that so they can even think about the problem. The other thing that was really important with this approach, and I think needs to happen in all risk communication, is we were emphasizing the consensus output of the scientific community. As individual scientists, we want to push what it is that we did individually and how important that is. But pretty much by definition of the scientific process, we are not allowing, if it's still exciting and interesting and cutting edge to us, it means it hasn't become consensus. And then the communication happens with the public in which we start arguing about whether or not that's the right result. And that undermines people's ability to believe in it. To the degree that we argue, we are emphasizing our uncertainty. And uncertainty is another thing that makes us, when it's uncertain, we emphasizes our feeling that our actions don't make a difference, that a feeling of self-efficacy disappears, and we get people to stop wanting to look at this. So what I've been doing recently is looking at a variety of other ways in which we can be using this emotional response to do it, because there are several factors that need to be taken into account. Again, not if we're going beyond communication to actually inspiring decisions. Because our risk is an affective response, we need to have emotions engaged. We have to believe that our actions make a difference, or all we're going to do is walk away from it. we have to believe it's worth it for us. It has to be personal, or we're otherwise not going to be making those decisions to act. And, as Louise was saying, the difference between response and long-term risk, that's clearly a problem, but we have to face the fact that imminent risk is always going to be more actionable, and we have to work harder if we want to get them from behind. So I'm going to wrap this up with a suggestion or demonstration of some other ways in which you can do it. And this is going to, right now, the work has been done in hurricanes and some other disasters. We don't really have this with earthquake at this point, but I'm going to show you this to show how effective a different approach can be. So if you go look up hurricane preparedness, just like if you look up earthquake preparedness, you're going to find various things, all these lists, remember all these things that you have to do. And when people get this information, it's simple language. They can mostly understand it. The question is, do they decide to go act on it? I'm going to show you an alternative, which has been created by a company, Pacifico Emiliano Rodriguez Nush, who's my partner in creating the Tempo program, other ways to get this type of information through. And Mark, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to turn it on. I want you to let me know right away if you aren't hearing the sound.
Hello, especially for those of you in the Caribbean. The match is about to start.
We are a team. We are prepared. We have the fighter.
My Caribbean brothers and sisters. It's our team season.
It's just a little quiet, Lucy, but I think people are hearing it.
It's efficient.
We should tell each other, this is the time for us to prepare together. Look out for your neighbor, the children sing, and with this team training lives, we go to sing. Food and water, you drink the trees, on the early, checking if I can protect them. I don't want to protect them. Check the news screen from them. Unless you want to bring a problem.
I'm big, prepared. Did you see? Don't care.
Disaster fighter. Together now. Hurricane fighter.
Disaster fighters are ready for the hurricane season.
It is together now. Disaster fighter.
We are in this together. We're one team.
Okay. Now I'll take us back to the science side of things. Emiliano was able to do a pretty interesting study on this with controlled groups who got exactly the same information in written form versus with music. This is props a little hard to see, but when music is here on the bottom, the direct communication is on top. when it was with music, there was a higher level of trust developed, a much stronger feeling of self-efficacy. Carrying this exact same information, people believed it made a difference much more when they heard it through music. And it all in all led to a much stronger intention to undertake this type of action. So I think we need to look at much more innovative ways, inventive ways. If we want to change people's perception, we need to acknowledge that it is not a completely analytically described or derived description of what the risk is, but is rather something that's very strongly affected by emotions. And of course, I'm personally a musician, so I see that as one of the best ways to get an emotional engagement. But if we want to get a broad range of action, I think we need to look at other tools that we take to do this. So that's what I have.
Well, thank you, Lucy, very much. Very interesting and really a remarkable shift in perspective. And what I'd like to do now is to open the floor to questions from the audience, if we have them in the chat.
Are we using chat or
We
question and answer?
yeah, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A tool, or just right now could go in the chat too, since we're gonna be able to keep an eye on it. There was one question already, but the person who asked it thinks it's already answered. Lucy, you might look in the chat to, it's the
Okay.
third thing up. See if you want to add anything more.
Well, actually, I think that, right, the hurricane, the whole thing of immediate response versus long-term response is one of the big issues. As I threw off there a comment, it's always easier to get action on an imminent question. And the hurricane stuff was intended for hurricane season. It isn't because a storm's coming in. It's getting ready at the beginning of the year, but at least it's for the next 6 months and not for the next 600 years, which is one of the problems we face with doing it with earthquakes. And I think that's why scenarios become particularly important for the events that occur less frequently, because as I said, you just don't get an emotional engagement out of an exceedance probability. You've got to find some other way, and understanding the broader consequences helps people do that.
And
If
now,
anyone is wanting to ask their question by voice, you're too shy to ask by text or whatever, you can raise your hand and I will be able to bring you in and we'll hear you. So that's an option as well. If you know how to do that using the React menu on your toolbar, you can raise your hand to ask your question, or you can continue to also type it. Louise, do you have any questions of our presenter?
I have a real question for Lucy. When you made this shift to understanding the importance of emotion, what were the primary ways that you thought we could introduce this in public communication? The video is one thing, but what we've also learned in social science is that there are multiple audiences in the community, people learn in different ways, they have access to different kinds of communication. Are there other ways then? I mean, I could see this on, TikTok, which is now being questioned, but on videos, YouTube, but are there other ways that we can engage people at different ages? And
Well, I think there's such a multitude of ways. It's hard to sit there and list them. I'll tell you, when we got in on the climate point, so this isn't about like, a disaster that's happening this year. This is rather about the bigger issues around climate change and inspiring people to take action. And they're convincing people of self-efficacy. What difference can I make about, CO2 emissions? And so it's important to look at the things that you can. And we were starting by thinking, make those cheerful videos, like we said, like this. Let's come up with songs that make people want to get engaged and prideful. But the reality is that people are already, if you think about climate and you understand it at all, you're going to get really depressed. You're going to be grieving. It's tempting to go into despair. And all of those are emotions that restrict action. You might also be really angry at the people who've been doing this, which makes you feel much more powerful, but it interferes with the collaborative action that's going to be needed to do this. So one of the things that we've done is doing lecture concerts where we combine information about the climate crisis and the actions you can do to make a difference with music to process the emotions that you're feeling about it. Because that's one of the big functions of music, is it allows you to experience emotions through some different pathways. And I personally, I mean, maybe this is being an over intellectualized person, but the music helps me become more aware of my emotions and bring it somewhat more into intersecting with the analytical space. So we've been doing an emotional arc. Let's think about how bad climate is and have music about grief and anger, and then move on to more positive things, and then have music that's more upbeat and combining it in some way. Right? And in fact, I just did it with a Baroque ensemble where it was completely instrumental music. So there's a variety of approaches. I'm still experimenting, I'd say. I think there's a lot of us experimenting. But it's pretty clear that the climate music that gets made by working with scientists and trying to represent data doesn't tend to lead to more positive action. It tends to lead to depression because it's pretty depressing.
Well, I'm going to switch to Ron. Ron, in your presentation, you showed maps.
Yeah.
And most people understand maps. And what is really critical is with maps, you can show relationships, but you can show relationships between physical things like electrical transmission stations and roads and bridges. Is there any way that you could combine some of the knowledge that Lucy is talking about to increase the confidence that people know where they're going if a bridge goes out or they need to evacuate or they're too close to electrical transmission station?
Well, I think that this is one of the issues that we're trying to study and get our arms around with regard to lifelines. There's a lot of interdependencies, things that we think are going to operate, may not be operating because there are other things that would certainly impact and would need to function in order for these things to operate. I think one of the things that I'd like to sort of emphasize is that the notion of interactive capabilities, I think, is very important. This is the reason why I was saying to be able to model things in real time, to model things by changing different parameters, I think is very important in understanding the scope of what could happen and what you could do to try and minimize and say mitigate these effects. For example, if you decide to mitigate or to increase the ability of a lifeline system to operate, if you were to increase the resilience, what impact would that have on other systems and so forth? And I think that having tools that would allow you to quantify that, I think is are very, very important. And the importance of scenarios, I think, are very critical. And again, if you can change the scenario so that it reflects maybe something smaller, maybe something larger, and so forth, I think it would give you at least a good idea of what the scope of the impacts would be, and maybe what you would have to do to try and mitigate it, for very.
Thanks. There was a question actually for Ron, which was, how do you get public agencies, and oops, let's see, I think we lost it here. Public agencies to adopt some of these technologies here.
What are the
and-
How
challenges?
should public agencies prepare to adopt and implement some of these risk communication technologies? What are some of the challenges?
Well, I think that, we need to be able to certainly understand what their needs are. For example, what sort of things are they interested in? And are we able to do things that would help quantify what the impacts, could be? For example, when you're looking at the performance of the systems, there are a lot of things that are going to impact that performance, and so you need tools, I think, to be able to look at the interactions among different components between different systems, so that you understand the full scope of how a disaster might impact them. And I think the more examples, I think the more examples that you can provide on how these technologies could be used to investigate things like, for example, response, recovery, restoration, and ultimately mitigation, I think are going to be very important.
That is true. Lucy, there's a really interesting question for you on skepticism.
Yeah, you're only looking, there's a couple of other questions that have been there for a while on Q&A. Can I address some of them? So
Sure.
Jacqueline Alman is asking about how to use small earthquakes to get attention on the big ones. And I would actually say that happens really organically, because people don't understand how big the difference is between the different events. If they feel it, it becomes real. And for instance, here in Southern California, we happen to have a bunch of 4s this year, and we are seeing. And I got invited to give more talks. I got asked for more advice on how to be putting stuff in. That happens pretty organically. One of the most important thing is when you are communicating about the small event is to just say, remember, this is really small, and the really big ones, where you have small ones, you also have big ones, and the big ones are going to be so much worse. Use that every time you're communicating about the small one. And then jump to the one on that you were seeing of science skepticism and the easy communication of miscommunication. It's a real problem. I will say that scientists are still more respected than most other sources of information, and that can, we can use that. But I think there's an issue when we, believe me, because I'm an important scientist and I said it's true, that argument is a lot less effective than it used to be. Because if you want a different answer, you can always find somebody else who's giving you a different answer. And I think that's, Dennis Milletti used to always say, the most important thing was that you had the same message coming from multiple sources. And that if you give an alternate answer, now people are in the position to choose which answer they want to respond to. And I think we saw that with COVID. You had a choice of which one you wanted to believe. I'm going to believe it's not that bad and I don't need the vaccines. There were plenty of officials saying that. And I think it was particularly dangerous is you then found people actively trying to tear down the scientists. And that's going to be effective to some extent. Right? I think it's less likely to happen in earthquakes. We're somehow a little more bipartisan or something. And I've noticed the difference if I post to social media about climate, I receive a significantly larger level of abuse. I almost never get it from earthquake stuff. But I post something about climate issues and it's abusive. Okay? And some of the social media venues at this point. So and you know, if there's somebody going to be actively tearing down and trying to attack, that's a really good way of undermining information. So we can't prevent it, but trying to lean into that sort of the reminding people of the analysis, the fact that there's peer-reviewed data. It doesn't get to everybody, but it helps with a lot of people.
Lucy, I'm sorry, we've got 1 minute left and
Right.
webinar is over. There are lots of questions. Hopefully Mark can capture the questions in the chat and we can respond to them later. But I'd like to just emphasize 3 quick takeaways. One from Lucy is the importance of building consensus about risk is much harder than we thought. And using emotion as a ticket to translate to action is really important. And Ron, the use of maps to show the interconnections in complex events is an age-old, really important problem that we're developing more and need to continue. And now I'm going to turn it over quickly to Craig Davis to close out the seminar. Craig?
Okay. Thank you, Louise. I want to give sincere thanks to yourself, Lucy and Ron, for having an excellent closing webinar. This is very interesting. We have lots of engagement. I also want to remind everybody the importance of all of the organizations and the speakers, moderators from all of the other webinars that we've had and the importance for creating this. But I really want to sincerely thank Mark Benthian for ensuring that all of these webinars were undertaken smoothly and successfully and recorded for everybody to see. And then lastly, I want to thank all of the attendees in the audience of this one and all of the other webinars. Now, Mark, I don't know if you have any other slides that you wanted to share.
No, we've ran out of time and it's fine. They were just bonus if we didn't. But I know we had talked about staying on a little bit longer. If we can ask a few more questions. I know, Louise, you have to run. But we
okay, so then let me do this, Mark. Let me I want to formally close this particular webinar for sake of respect of time of all of the audience. However, anybody on the audience who wants to stay on and communicate with Ron and Lucy and Mark and myself, and maybe with each other, we can stay for another maximum of 15 minutes. And so at this point, I'm going to hand this back to Mark because Louise will have to leave. And we will informally continue with the communications about this topic and maybe others. But we will proceed with that for anybody who wants to stay on. So Mark, I'm going to hand this back to you.
Thanks, Craig. Bye, Lucy. Thanks, Ron.
Bye.
Thank you, Louise, for being moderator with us today and helping to set this up.
Bye-bye.
We did. Let's get to 2 questions in the Q&A. One from Chris Hunt. Any thoughts on strategies in working with infrastructure owners who need to figure out a long-term plan to incorporate preparedness for earthquake and climate change impacts into a capital improvements program when currently they're focused on just keeping an aging system working? I'm thinking about smaller owners who don't have staff already working on these types of items.
I have one thought about this. I was working on the specific issue actually in Canada, looking at adaptation to what's coming from climate. And the biggest issue really seems to be misperceptions or sort of about how expensive the process is going to be. Right? People make quick decisions. Do I spend any of my valuable attention on even thinking about the problem? And you probably heard something about it 10 or 15 years ago when, heat pumps couldn't be used in Canada. Now they're effective and they can, but that perception that it wasn't worth it was still around. And so when you're trying to communicate with them about the issue, remember that the 2 things, that one of the most important things, they got to believe their actions make a difference. And people have a hard time getting there. And then the other thing is to really try to figure out a way of doing it where it's so much more cost effective to do the mitigation with the upgrades that you're doing anyway. Doing it as a separate thing is always more expensive. And one of the things that the whole thing about having a functional recovery building standard instead of a life safety standard, everyone assumes that it's going to be adding a lot of money to construction. Being able to focus, this adds about 1% to the cost of construction, and here's the data that shows this is true. That's been a much more useful way of getting people to engage in the discussion. So I think we've got misinformation, not disinformation. This isn't an intentional disruption of it, but people only have so much attention to spend, and they're going to be basing it on what information they've gotten in the past. And technology changes so quickly. People's perception of the effectiveness is usually out of date.
And I might chime in here as well. I think that what's important is to be able to quantify and demonstrate the value and benefit of some of these actions. And I think that, in fact, I think Craig Davis is a great example of what of how you approach this, because when he was at DWP, being able to identify, for example, where the vulnerable pipes are, what the impacts are, and so forth, I think provides a mechanism for prioritizing. You're not going to get everything done at one time. You need to look at this, in a phased approach, and using capital improvement programs, I think, to be able to phase this in and to address, the more vulnerable pipes, things that, will have a larger impact, I think is very important. So I think having, at least the ability to model what the possible impacts are, I think is very, very important. And so I think that from the standpoint of trying to do this in a way that makes sense cost effectively or cost wise, I think it's you need to understand where the vulnerable parts of the system are.
Okay, can I step in here, Mark, and follow up on the question related to this? Okay, so first, thanks for the shout out, Ron. Very appreciated. I get to leave this with a warm and fuzzy feeling. Both of you actually addressed that response on an analytical level. So that would be your right column, Lucy, in one of your slides earlier.
Yeah.
I had a similar thought. I raised my hand if there weren't any questions, but he had a lot of questions come up. So I lowered my hand. But when I saw Chris's question here, I thought, this is right up the alley of what I wanted. So I'm going to kind of put you on the spot. I apologize for that, but I think you might be able to handle this because you and I worked on the infrastructure part, right? You were helping in a catalyst and some of the things that I was able to do that Ron referred to when I was at LEDWP. I'm now trying to do this on a larger scale, a lot of them with smaller agencies. And what I was wondering and what I was intrigued with, all right, how do I forgot the word you used. So you had the analytical side and the other one. What
affective.
was that, Lucy?
The affect is
affective.
You could say emotional,
So how do I do the emotional? Maybe I don't know. Maybe that's how accidentally I was successful in some things. But how do we convince them on the emotional side when people like Chris and myself are dealing with infrastructure agencies? We are somewhat dealing with technical people, but they're not the decision makers. The decision makers are not the hazards experts. They're actually not necessarily infrastructure experts. Like they might not be a pipeline expert when you refer to things like Ron was talking about, but they are the decision maker. So do you have any ideas on how to use the effective side with that group of people? Because I think that's where we'll make our biggest bang for the buck.
I think you're right. And yeah, you're not going to go in and sing to them. I think that's going to make it.
Right, that's what I was thinking.
Right? But using a story is. So rather than emphasizing the numbers or even the cost effectiveness potentially, helping them address what the impact of not acting is, right? Because those guys making decisions, they can see the impact of acting. I'll get this benefit, but it's going to cost this much. And to be able, give them a concrete story of the impact of not acting. And it's to do it not in money, but I mean, like Ron was talking about, the all of those follow-on costs, we calculated them, but you present the story of you're not just hurting this, this individual company, you're rather having this regional economic impact, and it's the problem is we calculate with the economy and we need to communicate it with people, right? So rather than saying we'll lose this much money, these many people could lose their jobs, right? Is a more emotionally engaging outcome, right? Because so it's not. And yet we have, we always quantify it with money, because what else do you quantify it with?
Right.
But
You
putting
can
it in the
quantify it with,
terms,
could you quantify it in other ways, like with public health? Like, so if we're dealing with a sewer infrastructure system, you might say, you can have E. coli outbreaks, and here's some evidence of that, like from Christchurch. Or if you're dealing with water systems, people will perish if they don't have water.
Well,
These would be emotional type things as
yes.
well, right?
Well, the other thing with the water, I've used the story, like somebody I met in Christchurch who was just like, for the next 3 months, he spent 2 hours a day getting water for his family because he had to go
Right.
stand in line with containers and then
Yeah.
wanting to leave, right? And I often get to mass migration, the idea that people will abandon a community. And so if you love LA, is it going to, remember I used that when we did the stuff at City Hall, it was Imagine America without Los Angeles. I tried using a very emotional title to present the information from it. And I think that it's more sort of, it can be the same information, but it's how you communicate it and how you connect it to people who will be heard. And part of it affect, who are you talking to? What do they care about? Right?
Yeah.
And some of them don't give a damn about anything, and you're not going to get through to them on these things, right? But for ones who care about, mostly they're caring about their community. Right? If you're talking about public works infrastructure, they're doing that because they want things better for their community. And so putting it in that framework is a much easier place to engage with.
I'll point out there's a
thank you. That's
comment
good.
from Ken Hudnut on this
Yeah, go.
topic in the chat
Yeah.
with SoCal Edison. Everybody can look at that. And we have one last question too in the chat from Carl. Do the aesthetics or other presentation aspects of a risk map, color scheme, visual simplicity versus complexity, etc., have an effect on effectiveness of the map as a communication tool? Is that a consideration when preparing such maps?
It absolutely has an impact, but I'm going to let Ron talk about.
Yeah, in fact, in preparation for this particular webinar, I had to work with somebody to help me prepare a map that was certainly more visually attractive, but made more sense. For example, it was a map of ground motion. And what I had were these cells, these blocks. And so you had a block that was red, a block that was orange, and so forth. And I think, ground motion, doesn't, occur in blocks. It's more gradual. And so in order to demonstrate and to make that point, I had to work with somebody to make that sort of smooth transition that you would normally see in some of these shake maps. So I think it is very important, in how you display this information. It becomes even more important when you begin to try and describe performance, outage areas, which facilities are impacted, and so forth. And so we spend a lot of time, thinking very much about, how we display the results that we produce in ways that people could understand. But it's tough, I'm a very visual person, but still, you know, you're focused on some analytical things, and you don't always make that connection best. And I think that, you know, working with people that do that, for example, GIS people that do that for a living, is very important to me, because you know, they help to extend you know, what I'm trying to do in a much more visual and interactive way.
With that, we'll end the webinar and the webinar series. Thanks, everyone.